And we're back here for part two on succession planning. Let's get back to it.
Let me deal with the time frame question from a different perspective. Okay. You know, um, I think that you need to sort of work in kind of three kind of dimensions at the same time. One is, 12 to 18 months. There's time. There's a lot of job shadowing. There's a lot of coaching. There's external training. There's a whole bunch of other sort of things that we can do. There's a special projects. There's the lateral moves. There's this secondments. So we can do this in a very strategic kind of way, and then we make the decision. Okay, or if you're a very small organization, you do the transition, right? So that is the beautiful strategic way. That's kind of the optimal, let's just say. The other is, something, something's going to happen, and in 3 months to 6 months, there has to be a change for whatever reason. So, for example, somebody in a key position, for whatever reason, he's in that position, and his significant other, she's being tapped for a job in another jurisdiction, and they're moving, and the job cannot be done remotely, right? Maybe the significant other is an academic and they just got a professorship somewhere else. And so, gee, you know that you've got 3 to 6 months. So that particular case, it's a bit of a, I don't want to say a crash course, but it's a question of, okay, we gotta lean in here, folks. Okay, we've got to make an early decision. We've got to do some fast learning. Okay. So, imagine the first approach is okay, you're going to learn to swim. So let's dip your toes in. Let's go to the beach so you could walk in. Okay, mommy and daddy are going to help you. Like it's a very, very slow kind of thing so that there's that comfort and confidence and all the little I's are dotted and T's crossed and everything. What I just described a second ago, that called the 3 to 6 months, it's okay. You're in your jump in the water. Okay, this is how you float. Okay, this is how you do the front crawl. This is how you do such and such. The back crawl. I don't know, whatever it is. And so you've got a definitive course of action that's taking place because there's a defined deadline. The third case is the scariest, and this is a real challenge. And I have to say, I've felt this one intimately, personally. What happens all of a sudden when the person suddenly passes away? What happens? I haven't passed away yet. Okay. What happens when somebody suddenly gets a terrible, terrible uh, health diagnosis and suddenly is away, like away unreachable, starting tomorrow, right? What happens when somebody gets hit by a bus tomorrow and suddenly is not there? And there wasn't enough time to do planning, right? And all of a sudden, somebody is now the new whatever the role is, right? And so, for everybody in this call, and I suspect everyone in the call is um, who's listening on the podcast or live, I suspect is in a responsible position. What would happen if all of a sudden you were not there? Bam. Okay, some terrible tragedy happened, right? What would happen? So, wouldn't it be wise to say, here's the plan as to what should happen if God forbid that were the case? Do you have a manual for your successor who that cannot ask you, where the where the such and where the paper supplies are stored, okay, or about some contract that you sign, or some fill in the blank, whatever it is. Can you put that down on paper, right? Because once you've got that, you can say, okay, now we've got something. Then you can say, well, gee, is there some, if that were to happen, this is contingency planning. Who would probably step in? Maybe it's the chair of the board or somebody on the board. Maybe it's somebody that's on your team who would step up in an acting capacity, right? Don't know what it is. And then it's a conversation of, okay, so and so, let's spend some time just in case this were ever to happen, right? And so at least that way, that would be. The other two are you've got a little bit of time, but it's not crisis mode, right? But you should also do some succession planning for the crisis mode. I will say that if you do that proper succession planning, that's strategic, get ahead of the curve. God forbid if something terrible happens to one of these key roles, guess what? The race car's on the track. Things are moving already, right? Some successors have already been designated, right? Or potential successors have been designated for your role. Somebody else can make the decision if as to which one actually, gets the job. But at least you've been giving them experiences along the way so that they can do that job, right? I think it's a fascinating conversation. I'll share one thing. Okay, I was 25 years old. I was getting one of my professional certifications, CFA. I got I got out of the subway as I was crossing the street. I happened to be the first pedestrian crossing, and guess what? A car came out, went right through the red light, and knocked me out. And I was in the hospital for a month. You know, it was a bit of a shock. It was a shock to me. Okay, but guess what? My role, I was a junior at that particular time. I wasn't in a critical strategic facing role, but still there was things that were on my plate that needed to get done. There's client commitments that had to be addressed, right? And so, they dealt with it. Okay. They dealt with it because I was in a relatively junior role. But it happened to me again. Here I was, excuse me, went into the doctor, got a blood test. What a surprise. I was diagnosed with leukemia. Yes, I'm here today. All is good, right? But I was out for 7 months, right? So who would have known? Thank God I had an exceptionally competent colleague, my COO, who was able to step in and did an amazing job. Why was he able to step in? It was hard for him. He had to learn how to be a CEO. It's because there's a lot of conversations that happened before, and a lot of mentorship that happened before, right? So, let's just say lightning doesn't strike twice. I'm not looking for a third strike, if you know what I mean. But it can happen to anyone, and it happens unexpectedly. And making sure that you've doing some of the succession planning along the way means that if something happens, it becomes a lot easier, an awful lot easier to fix. And by the way, the fact that those two little breaks I had, unexpected breaks these are the kinds of things that really, for me, locked in why succession planning is just such an important, critical, and strategic thing that boards and senior leaders need to make sure that they've got in place. So, didn't think I was going to talk about that today, but it's true.
Randall, you gave the example of the employee who shares, they come into the boss's office and says, look, we're moving. My spouse got a job. I'll be gone in 3 to 6 months. And thank you very much. There's a smooth transition. They know they have that timeline, but they have that time together to make it happen. Okay. Randall, I can think of many examples of people I know and people you and I know in common where they have that discussion. Look, I'm looking to start my own project. I'm looking to move, looking to go back to school, whatever the reason they give. And they say, I am here 100% for that smooth transition. I'm here to partner with you. Let's have a smooth process. And they shut it down and say, bye bye. Please give us your 2 weeks notice. And they are just so eager to move on. So, like, it's like, how do we create that culture where we can, we're trying to talk about succession planning, but when your employees are loyal enough to partner with you, they're like penalized, and who wins? Like, how do we resolve this?
This is a culture issue, isn't it? It is an absolute culture issue. You know, um, if leaders don't understand, um, sorry, I shouldn't dump it on the leaders. It's not the leaders, okay? If the organization as a whole has not explored something yet, then leaders and organizations, you know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. And from an employee perspective, who's loyal and needs to leave for whatever reason, um, you know, like I can understand if somebody's leaving to go to a competitor, here you go, here's your 2 weeks 2 weeks of pay and off you go. We don't want you, if you're moving to a competitor, to be around. I understand that. But I think it's lazy, okay, when a manager says bye-bye, right? Because they're losing a huge opportunity of a willing partner in knowledge transfer, right? And so creating the culture where it's a lot more collaborative, right? Or where career planning conversations actually take place is something that not everybody is thinking about, right? We've got the most innovative culture. Well, guess what? Innovation is critically important. We've got the most fill in the blank culture, also very important. And we've got the most, we get it, we got to get it done culture. All these things are important and everything. But, tools make it possible, but people make it happen, right? And if we don't sort of make sure we've got the culture that supports these conversations, then we're missing something, right? We're missing something. We're paying for everybody who to work at our shop anyway. Why can't we have a place to work where, people are having a little bit more fun, that they feel like they're there for a purpose, right? Where you realize there's some things you can do together that are far more powerful than if you did it by themselves. And succession planning is one of those activities.
I'm ready. I'll ask another question, new topic, okay? If you open up your average org chart, Randall, you can easily find that companies will have more employees, more contractors, more resources working to recruit and fish for external talent than working on internal development and succession strategies. Okay? I'm curious to hear your perspective on why this might be. And if I can editorialize the question, is it because of the human condition to think the grass is greener?
Um, it's oh man, I think there's a lot underneath that question. So let me try and unpack it a bit. Um, you know, if you got a dog, it barks. If you got a cow, it says moo, right? Like everybody does what they're built to do for, including recruiters. So if you've got recruiters on staff, very often they're going to go recruit outside because that's kind of what they're built to do. The more progressive and thoughtful organizations realize that every time we make an investment in our people, and sometimes even when they don't make an investment, they just let people like work away and work away and work away. People learn an awful lot from their peers, from the industry, from any courses that they might be sent on, by participating in different things, by the informal mentorship and everything. And so here you've got a need to fill a particular role. And the best person for that role is Pat, for example. And Pat, say, reports to this manager, and the manager says, Pat is doing such a great job. Pat is fantastic, right? And then in their mind, they're saying, I don't want to lose Pat. So a strategic recruiter will always look inside. They always will, right? So they knock on the manager's door and said, Pat fits the profile, right? Or maybe they post it internally and Pat applies. But eventually there's a conversation with Pat's manager. And Pat's manager says, you know something, we've spent a lot of time building Pat up into this particular role. I can't let her go. There's no one else who can do Pat's job. She's critically important. And on it goes, on it goes. This is just Pat. Pat is further down in the organization, right? And what we suddenly see is that because somebody does not want to let a key staff member move on to something even greater, okay, that person's stymied. They're sort of locked in that particular place, and then that recruiter then has to go outside and look for somebody, right? And I think sadly, what we're doing is we're seeing the succession planning problem writ large, okay, because Pat and their manager, okay, haven't sort of figured out that, gee, Pat is going to leave unless Pat gets the career inside the organization that Pat wants, right? So why not provide that career path within the organization for Pat? And you can find somebody else to fill Pat's role. And by the way, manager, what if Pat got hit by a truck or got an awful cancer diagnosis or suddenly, left for whatever reason? You'd have to replace Pat anyway. So why not keep Pat in the organization? You'll have a good relationship with somebody that you made desirable to another part of the organization, right? So we're seeing the succession planning problem, if you will, appear further down in the organization. So if we've got this kind of succession planning mindset that's at the top middle for the key roles, it impacts the culture so that by the time it gets to Pat's manager, maybe, just maybe, Pat's manager will say, you know something, I really would hate to lose Pat from this role, but you know, if she really if she's really the right person, of course, let her interview. Of course, I'd support her. right? But then, recruiter, you got to help me find somebody to fill Pat's role, right? And those are conversations that I just wish happened a bit more often. I know in the best organizations they do happen, but I also see many cases where somebody's shoehorned uh, into a shoehorned into a particular role because their quote's so good and their manager does not want to let them go. It's short-sighted, right? And on every level, Pat will just leave, right? So why not keep Pat in the organization, right? Be the hero of somebody who could develop people like Pat who are so valuable.
They say the best defense is a good offense. Okay, so how can we apply this to succession planning? You talked about keeping Pat, keeping him happy, keeping him in the organization. Replacing employees is expensive. Recruiters are expensive. Hiring someone who isn't the best fit employee is definitely expensive. Like, is a strategy not just who to replace them, but like we also need thinking on like how to keep Pat happy?
That's a great question because it speaks to the issue of, on one hand, excuse me, we're doing strategic succession planning for all those critical roles, whether it be leadership or specialized knowledge, etc. Okay. But Pat and Pat's manager might be much further down the organization, right? So how do we sort of get that everywhere? Okay. So that's one side of it. And the other hand is how do we make sure that we build up all the Pats within the organization to make them more internally valuable and so they're all talking the same language. And so there's three different things that you could do there. One is, as a leader, you do town halls so you can get your message out to everybody, and everyone gets the same language because it's one to many, right? Making sure the communication plan sort of helps amplify that leadership message. Number two is, many organizations bring everyone together, and whether it's a workshop with an external leader or getting somebody like me, a professional speaker, in to sort of motivate and to share content, so share knowledge to everybody, so everyone gets that same message all at once, right? That's number two. Number three is the question of how do we drip in continuous professional development to everybody, right? They sometimes talk about the management problem in the middle, right? Where you've got the leadership is all fully aligned, and the people on the front line who are doing the stuff, if you will, want to do the stuff, but that management in the middle, it's for whatever reason things don't sort of get through, if you will, to that front line. So another way beyond just like having a speaker sort of broadcast to everybody is to drip the knowledge in with what we call continuous professional development. So imagine, for example, a webinar every month, okay, and then office hours where people can ask questions about the context of it. It's one to many, but it means that particularly if it's archived, there's ways of having people learn about stuff and upskill. So what if one of those monthly webinars was on succession planning and on building up your own skill base and your responsibility to do so, etc. What if another one was on certain types of management, right? Which would speak to the managers of the PAT, not just the PATs, etc. With all this kind of knowledge being dripped into the organization, what that does is it brings alignment and a common vocabulary to everybody in a whole bunch of different areas, not just succession planning or management or culture or a whole bunch of other things, right? And I'm not advocating, by the way, every month you get another speaker to do another webinar. No, it's got to be part of a narrative, right? And the narrative has got to be aligned with what the leadership overall story actually is. So um, this is how I would approach that one.
Linda, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Appropriately, all the talk about succession planning on the inside. I've been in the nonprofit game long enough to see the best laid plans get blown away by the board, because ultimately who gets to succeed the person is the board's decision. And I've seen it go from broken hearts and hard feelings to litigation. Anyway, I just want to shout out the board's role in sometimes making the best laid plans go completely sideways.
So let me build on that. Thank you, Linda. That's a very, very important point. So the role of the board is interesting because if we think about the president, CEO, executive director, the decision for that person's replacement is the board's responsibility. Yes, that the CEO, the executive director, the person in that corner office, excuse me, they've got to execute to make sure that there's candidates that are suitable, right? But no, it's not the CEO's job to anoint who their successor is. And therefore, the kinds of conversations as a CEO that you have to the potential successors are ones that have got to be very clear. I'm not making the decision. This is the board's responsibility. My role here is to make sure that I'm giving you enough experiences so that you are a viable candidate for the board to select. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is to prep the board, right? You're communicating down, you're communicating up, right? So that there's likely there might be a compensation committee, or there might be a personnel committee, whatever it's called, or maybe it's a discussion of the board itself, right? And for you as a CEO to say, this is what's happening in terms of succession planning. Okay, here are the critical roles, that framework I talked about earlier. Here are the critical roles. Here's the skills for those roles. Here's some potential successors. Here's what I'm doing with each of these successors, etc. And here's the time frames that might be possible, right? And then it becomes a lot easier for the board to say, okay, risk abated. It looks like we've got things in hand, etc. So when we need to make our decision, right? And sometimes the decision is, particularly for the C-suite, is we
Sorry,
want
I'm in the
fresh
room.
blood. We want fresh blood. We want outside, right? And we're going to recruit somebody outside. The second level team, they're excellent. We just need somebody who's got a different type of direction, and we do not want to move somebody. So that might be part of it as well. But what are you doing as a CEO? And you have some control over the agenda to allow the people who are potential successors to have some airtime, to allow the board members to see them in action. Maybe they are involved in some committees as well, right? Because they've got to prove themselves, not just to you to get your imprimatur, but also to the board members. So when the board does make that decision, it becomes an awful lot easier for them to say, yeah, with confidence, we think this person. Or something, of those three or of those two potential successors, that's not really where we want to go. And here's why. Right. And so that is really, really important. For all the other roles, usually it's the CEO who could make those decisions. Why? Because the CEO is being held responsible for it. For some roles, I sit on the board of a public company. Well, guess what? New CFO, the board's going to get involved, right? Right. The board's going to be making that decision on the recommendation of the CEO, right? And perhaps for some other very, very, very critical roles as well. So it's different depending on the scale, from my public company work on one side to my not-for-profit work on the other side to my founders work on the other side. It's kind of like a volume control on a radio or a stereo. You get to choose how much you actually turn that volume knob up. But let's just not keep it on zero, on off, because it's got to be somewhere. And if your job is to develop your people, why not sort of overlay the whole question of succession planning on top of them?
Something we often talk about with our clients, with leaders, is the connection between corporate brand of the organization and the personal brand of those key visible employees, and the connection between the two. So when we think about succession planning, we have people asking about what's the timeline, what has to happen, what does mentorship look like, what if they leave? But what about that personal brand that may need to be developed and may need to be curated? Like, how do we bake that into the conversations and the plan?
There is a lot of different models, if you will, for personal brand of the CEO, and corporate brand of the organization. In the not-for-profit world, it's the CEO is often the strength behind the quiet behind the push, etc. In the corporate world, the question is, how might we use the CEO's personal brand, and how might the CEO choose to use it, and how far is the board willing to allow that to happen? Here's two examples of the extreme. You know, On one hand, you've got Cook, the CEO of Apple, who is exceptionally quiet publicly. Every once in a while, he says something, but he does not have an out there brand. On the other hand, Elon Musk of Tesla, at the very beginning, his brand was very positive, wasn't it? It was one that powered the innovation of his companies. I'm thinking of Tesla particularly, right? But at the time of this recording, his brand is gone. Let's just say it's very negative on a whole bunch of different fronts with a whole bunch of different people. Some people still love him, no doubt, but the stock price is down very significantly, and people driving around cars that said, "I bought the Tesla, I didn't buy into Elon Musk." Right? This is the exact opposite. So when it comes to the question of succession, the question is, okay, so if the brand of the CEO is so strong and personal, right? That if they left, they chose to leave, you fired them, they got recruited away, whatever, and also for the next level down as well. How do we make sure that when we get somebody to succeed, they're, that we backfill somehow, right? And so if we look back at Apple, when Steve Jobs sadly passed away, he had a very out there public brand. Yet they replaced him with somebody who was pretty much silent and unknown, right? And for whatever reason, they've 10x the size of their business, right? On the other hand, sometimes a very lackluster brand would need somebody who's got a little bit of public profile to actually make a difference. I think one of the more interesting cases, and you have to go back in your memory a little bit to if you're in Canada where I'm physically located, we have a grocer, Loblaws, that has got a brand called President's Choice. And if you sort of look way back, it wasn't called President's Choice at the very beginning. It was called Dave Nichols, who, by the way, was the president. Dave Nichols, President's Choice. And the president himself was the pitchman in TV commercials. In the advertisements, there's a picture of him smiling with a chef hat in front of the barbecue with one of his products, etc. And it was all about Dave Nichols, right? Pitching the President's Choice products, different than No Name, different than the brand names, etc. But that's what it was. And when Dave Nichols departed, was no longer the president, the company had to change its branding, and it just became President's Choice, not Dave Nichols' President's Choice, right? And from the pitching, they changed the way they sold the products in terms of their print advertising and their TV, right? And so organizations will evolve one way or the other, but not recognizing that there's a branding gap that sometimes has to be addressed. Sometimes, like in the case of Apple or Loblaws, where you say, we don't need the pitchman, if you will, Steve Jobs or Dave Nichols to be the face of the company. Let's see about doing a little bit more branding in the on the company itself, not the actual person who's in that role. Let me just sort of comment on one other thing. The whole idea of, do we have an individual development plan for each person, right? Who is a potential successor, right? And if we had the conversation with them as to what that looks like, and if we had the conversation about, how much of this is your responsibility and how much of it is our responsibility? How are you going to step up to sort of prove yourself at this new level, right? And from the company's perspective, can we do things like, say, job shadowing? Or if somebody's away, can you have somebody step in as, acting in that role for that 1 or 2 weeks, say, vacation that you're away, right? Just to give them a test drive, but also to give you a test drive based on the feedback of their performance during that time. There's an awful lot that can be done in the area of succession, and if we only just put our mind to it.
Thank you, Randall, and everyone here for the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for asking your questions. If any of the issues we talked about resonate with you, if you're considering a change and want our perspective, if you're working on your own succession plans within your organization and curious about how to have those conversations, create that healthy culture around discussion, discussing session planning, please reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation and share resources. If you want to get the invites to these monthly live sessions, do reach out at podcast@randallcraig.com. We'll look forward to seeing you again and see you on LinkedIn.